Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep today into another fascinating corner of the Enneagram, the Type 8, specifically the conservation subtype, or as they're sometimes called, the survivalist. This one's always intrigued
Oh,
me.
sure, for sure. For sure. You see those strong 8 traits, that intensity.
But then there's this whole other layer
Right. Yeah.
focused on, well, literally conservation.
Absolutely.
And to really bring this to life, we're going to be using a source that breaks down Wolverine. Yep, X-Men's Wolverine as like the prime example of an E8 conservation.
Nah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Honestly, I can't think of a better example off the top of my head.
I know, he's all about survival, protecting his own.
He really is the archetype, isn't he? But before we jump into Wolverine and all of that, maybe we should back up a sec. Can you give us like a quick recap of what exactly defines an E8 conservation? Like what sets them apart, even from, other eights?
Yeah, great point. Let's set the stage.
Okay, so as you know, all eights share that core desire for control, right? And that deep fear of vulnerability being taken advantage of.
Right.
Right. But the conservation subtype, they take that energy and they put it into, well, conserving. It's about securing resources, building that safety net, ensuring survival, not just for themselves, but for their people, their tribe, you could say.
It's almost like they're building a fortress.
Exactly.
Both literally and, metaphorically,
Yeah.
to protect themselves and those they care about. Which is interesting because in some ways that sounds a bit like a he too, right? The helper type.
Well, that's a good point. And that's actually where those connecting types come in, but we'll get to that later.
Yeah.
For now, think of it this way. It's not just about personal power, like for some eights. It's about establishing security, self-sufficiency for their chosen few, often their family, their closest people.
They want to be that solid rock everyone can lean on.
Exactly. They want to be the one everyone knows they can depend on.
Got it. So where does our favorite Claude hero fit in? How does Wolverine, embody this?
Well, the source points out that so many of Wolverine's actions, even like his whole backstory, just scream E8 conservation. He's constantly battling, fighting to protect himself, and those few he lets get close.
Yeah.
Remember in X-Men Origins, Wolverine, when he
Yeah.
goes to all those lengths to rescue his girlfriend, or in Logan, I mean, he goes through so much to protect Xavier.
Totally. And he's not exactly Mr. Chatty, is he?
No, not at all.
He's all about action, solving problems physically,
Yeah.
making sure those basic needs are met, shelter, eliminating threats, very material world, concrete solutions, which we see in E8 conservation.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. Even how he communicates, right? Concise, forceful, to the point. Total E8 conservation. You get this feeling he's always like sizing up a situation, strategizing, ready to jump into action in a split second. It's like he's always in that survival mode.
And yet there's this lone wolf element to him, too.
Yeah.
Even with the X-Men, he always seems a bit on the outskirts, like he's ready to go his own way.
That's a great observation. And that's actually where the 5 connection comes in, which we talked about.
Right.
Conservations, they have this really interesting blend of dominance, but also introversion. So they may appear, less outwardly aggressive than other E8s, say the sexual subtype, but they are always observing, calculating.
Valuing their autonomy.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so cool how those connecting types, they add these nuances to that core type. So we've got this picture of the E8 conservation as this resourceful protector, driven by action, this deep-seated need for control. But what about internally? What's going on under the surface emotionally? I mean, we all know Wolverine's he's a bit of a brooder, right?
He is. Well, the source mentions satisfaction being a core passion for E8 conservations. Think of it as this very almost primal need to have their survival needs met quickly, decisively. Like they have a very, very low tolerance for frustration.
They're just wired for that immediate action.
Exactly. Any delay, obstacle, it throws them off balance.
You see that with Wolverine all the time. Someone gets in his way, plans get messed up, and bam. He gets so impatient, almost like restless.
Exactly. And it's not about indulging in pleasure, right? It's about achieving that feeling of security control as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And when they encounter obstacles, that's when their primary defense mechanism kicks in.
Which is
Denial.
so they just block out anything that makes them feel vulnerable.
Essentially, yeah. They reject weakness, downplay danger, push through pain, all to maintain that sense of power, self-sufficiency. Think of how stoic Wolverine is, how he just kind of shrugs off injuries, pushes past his limits.
Yeah, it's like he's denying his own humanness to maintain this image of invincibility.
Right. But But it's important to keep in mind that this need for control, it doesn't have to be about being like malicious or dominating others. It often comes from that deep-seated fear of vulnerability we talked about.
So it's more about self-preservation than a desire for power over others.
Exactly. It's about creating a sense of safety, order in a world that often feels chaotic, unpredictable.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction. It makes me think about how this could play out in, say, the workplace, or even in our personal relationships. I mean, this control thing, it's got to be a bit of a double-edged sword.
Oh, absolutely. It can be a source of incredible strength, resilience, but it can also lead to some real conflict if it's not, managed consciously. But before we get into that, I think we need to unpack those connecting types a bit more, dive into those. I think they really add a layer of complexity to the E8 conservation that people often miss.
You're right. We definitely need to unpack those. They're key to understanding how this subtype really works in the real world. All right, so connecting types, you mentioned they add this extra layer of complexity to the E8 conservation.
They do, they do. Remember, these connections, they act like almost like modifiers, right?
Yeah.
Shaping how that core type expresses itself. And for the EA conservation, we're looking at the influences of both type 5 and type 2.
Okay, so let's start with the 5, the investigator. How does that energy, like, blend with the 8's need for control? Because those seem like they could potentially clash.
You're right. It creates this fascinating kind of paradox, right? On the one hand, you've got the 8's need for, dominance, action. And then on the other, you've got the 5's more introspective, knowledge-seeking nature.
Yeah, yeah. You see that in Wolverine's lone wolf thing, right? He's always off, seeking his own path, often operating outside of, like, the established systems, the rules.
Right. The 5 connection, it really amplifies that need for autonomy, self-reliance, but it's not just about being a loner, isolating themselves completely. It also brings in this tendency to withdraw, conserve energy.
Yeah.
Much like a 5, retreating to their little refuge.
So it's less about fear, more about, like, strategic recharging. Like when Wolverine disappears off into the wilderness, but he's got a purpose, right? It's not just running away.
Yeah, precisely. They withdraw not out of fear, but to refocus,
Right.
regain a sense of equilibrium so they can effectively protect their resources, their domain. And this connection, it can also lead to a more intellectual approach to problem solving than you might see with other 8.
Okay, that makes sense. Like, yeah, Wolverine's all about that brute force when he needs to be. But he's also, he's using his cunning, his observation skills to his advantage. He plans, anticipates, he's strategic.
Exactly. It's not just about reacting impulsively. It's about using their intelligence, and strategy to achieve their aims, their goals. Now, the type 2 connection, that adds a whole other flavor to the mix.
This is where I get a little lost, I guess, because, 2s, the helpers, they're all about nurturing, connecting with others. So how does that fit in with, with the 8's need for control?
It creates this really compelling tension, right? That the 2 connection, it manifests as this deep, almost primal protective instinct towards their loved ones.
Yeah.
But it's not about like emotional coddling or overt affection. It's about providing for their material needs, ensuring their security, and fiercely defending their territory, so to speak.
So less about hugs and more about, like, building that fortified bunker stocked with supply.
Exactly, you got it. It's about tangible acts of service, protection, and this can extend beyond just, the immediate family. E8 conservations, they can be very, very loyal to their chosen groups, whether it's their community, a cause they believe in.
I'm starting to see how this subtype can be both incredibly strong, but also, like, surprisingly complex. It's not just about being tough or being the boss. It's about this deep sense of responsibility for the people in their circle. But doesn't this whole control thing, like, doesn't that make close relationships tricky?
That's a great point. Healthy expression, that's key for any Enneagram type, of course, but especially, I think, for the E8 conservation. Their need for control, it can create friction if they're not, mindful of the needs and boundaries of others.
So what would that look like an E8 conservation struggling with boundaries?
Imagine someone who always needs to have the last word, constantly taking charge, or, making decisions for others without really consulting them. They may have the best intentions, wanting to protect, provide, but their approach can come across as, domineering, even suffocating.
So it's about finding that balance between, like, protectiveness and allowing others to have their own agency.
Exactly, exactly. And that's where, self-awareness comes in a big way. It's crucial for them to understand their own motivations, what's driving them, recognize how their actions are impacting others, and learn to express their needs in a way that's healthy, and respectful.
Which I imagine can be pretty tough for the EA conservation. They're so used to just like being decisive, taking action, being the one in charge.
It can be a challenge for sure, but it's absolutely essential for building healthy, balanced relationships, learning to compromise, to collaborate, to trust that others can handle things on their own. And these are all skills that can really help E8 conservations foster more balanced connections.
Yeah, makes sense. And it strikes me that this whole control thing, it's not just limited to, personal relationships. It could also impact, how EA conservations approach their work lives, how they solve problems.
Oh, absolutely. In a professional setting, that need for control, it often manifests as a very strong leadership style, right? They're
Right.
they're often naturals at taking charge, setting clear expectations, driving projects forward.
Mm.
But it can also lead to, conflict if they're micromanaging or bulldozing over their colleagues.
It's that double-edged sword you mentioned. Like their strengths can also be their downfall if they're not, wielded carefully.
Right, exactly. And it's not just the interpersonal dynamics either. This can also impact how they approach, challenges in general. Remember, their core passion is satisfaction, that need for, swift, decisive resolution.
Which, yeah, totally tracks with like that whole survivalist instinct. But I imagine that could lead to, impatience, maybe even frustration when things don't go as planned.
Precisely. They might struggle with ambiguity, right?
Oh.
Situations that require more flexibility or a more collaborative approach. Learning to embrace those gray areas, be more adaptable, more patient. That can be incredibly valuable for their growth.
So it sounds like the key takeaway here is, again, self-awareness,
Yeah.
recognizing those patterns, understanding like why those patterns are there, what's driving them.
Absolutely. And that's true for all the Enneagram types, but I think especially so for the EA conservation. It's about harnessing that incredible strength, that protectiveness they have, but channeling it in a way that benefits not just themselves, but also, the people around them.
It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot between safeguarding their own needs, but also respecting the autonomy of others, learning to be a strong leader, but also a collaborative partner.
You put it perfectly. And remember, this is a journey, right? It's not like a destination you arrive at. Personal growth, it's an ongoing process.
Right.
And the Enneagram, it simply provides a framework for, self-discovery, understanding.
It's like having the map, but you still got to choose which path you want to take.
Exactly. And sometimes the most scenic routes, the most rewarding ones, they're the ones that require a little exploration, a little willingness to step outside your comfort zone.
I love that. Earlier we were talking about how Wolverine embodies all these E8 conservation traits. Did the source mention any real-life examples, people who may be a bit more relatable than a superhero?
They did. They did. And it's a pretty diverse list, which really highlights how these traits can manifest in such different contexts. For example, they mentioned figures like Henry VIII.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see that. He was all about control, right? Securing the dynasty, accumulating wealth, power, the whole nine yards.
Exactly. But they also mentioned figures like John Wayne, the classic strong, silent type. He often played those protector roles in his films, embodying that rugged individualism, that fierce sense of loyalty.
Interesting. So it's not always about like literally being a king or a warrior or something. It's more about that underlying energy, that drive to take charge, defend what's theirs.
Right, exactly. And interestingly enough, the source even mentioned the spiritual teacher Gurdjieff, who was actually very instrumental in bringing the Enneagram to the West.
Wait, a spiritual teacher? I thought, 8-8s, especially the conservation subtype, they were all about the material world. That's an interesting example.
It is. It is. It's a good reminder that these types, they can express themselves in unexpected ways. Gurdjieff, he was known for his very demanding, sometimes confrontational teaching style. Pushing his students to face their limitations, to really grow. Some might say that aligns with that 8 assertiveness, that willingness to challenge.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about what they do, but how they do it, right?
Yeah.
That energy they bring to their chosen path.
Exactly. Exactly. And of course, it's important to remember that, these are just a few examples. Enneagram types, they're not about putting people in, neat little boxes.
Yeah.
It's about understanding those core motivations, those fears that shape our behavior.
So how can understanding like all of this E8 conservation stuff with all its complexities, its contradictions, how can that actually help us, in our own lives?
Yeah.
Because knowing is one thing, but like what can we actually do with this information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I think that leads us to the real-world application of all this. How can we recognize these traits, both in ourselves and in others, and then, use that understanding to navigate our interactions in a more informed way, a more compassionate way?
I'm all ears. This is where it gets really interesting for me. So much what we've been talking about, it really resonates, especially that line between, protectiveness and control. It seems like that's got to be a tough thing for EA conservations to navigate, especially in those close relationships.
It can be. It can be. One of the biggest, I think, challenges they face is learning to let go of the reins a little bit. Their instinct is to take charge, make the decisions, protect their loved ones from harm. But that can really backfire if it's not balanced with respect for the other person's autonomy.
Right. Right. So like practically speaking, what does that actually look like? How can someone with these E8 conservation traits, how can they, work on finding that balance?
Well, I think a great first step is simply becoming aware of those patterns, those ingrained patterns,
Mm.
recognizing when that need for control kicks in and asking themselves, is this really about protecting the other person? Or is it about my own discomfort with uncertainty, with not being in charge?
Yeah, that's a big difference.
It is. It
It's
is.
like they need to hit pause
Yeah.
before just jumping into action.
Exactly. And from there, it's about practicing, active listening, truly hearing the other person's perspective, their needs, even if they don't align with their own.
Which I imagine for an E8 conservation, that's got to be a tough one. They're
Yeah.
so used to being, decisive, taking action.
It is. It definitely can be a challenge, but it's so essential for building those healthy relationships, learning to, compromise, collaborate, to trust that others are capable of handling things on their own. These are all skills that can really help E8 conservations create those more balanced connections.
Yeah. It also makes me think that this whole control issue is not just about personal relationships. It could also impact how they approach, their work life, their careers, even like problem solving in general.
Oh, absolutely. In a professional setting, that need for control, it can be a real asset, right? It often manifests as a very strong leadership style.
Mm.
They're often like naturals at taking charge, setting those clear expectations, driving projects forward.
Hmm.
But it can also lead to problems if they're micromanaging or not really valuing the input of others.
Again, it's that double-edged sword. Strengths can become weaknesses if they're not aware of them.
Right, exactly. And it's not just about, the interpersonal dynamics either. This can impact how they approach any kind of challenge, really.
Oh.
Remember, their core passion is satisfaction, that need for swift, decisive resolution.
Right. Makes sense with that whole like survivalist mindset.
Yeah.
But I can see how that could lead to, impatience, maybe even frustration when things don't go exactly according to plan.
Absolutely, absolutely. They might struggle with ambiguity, situations that require more flexibility, a more collaborative approach. So learning to embrace those gray areas, to be more adaptable, more patient, that can be so valuable for their growth, both personally and professionally.
So it sounds like the real key here is that self-awareness piece, right?
Well,
Recognizing those patterns and then understanding like what's driving those patterns,
yeah,
Why are they there?
you nailed it. That's really the foundation of growth for any type. And for the conservation, it's about harnessing the incredible strength, that protectiveness they have,
Yeah.
but learning to channel it in a way that benefits, not just themselves, but the people around them.
It's about finding that sweet spot between like safeguarding their own needs, but also respecting the autonomy of others,
Yeah.
learning to be a strong leader, but also a collaborative partner.
Beautifully said. And remember, this is a journey, right? Not a destination.
Hmm.
Personal growth, it's an ongoing process. It's a lifelong thing. And the Enneagram, it just provides a framework, for
Cool.
self-discovery, for
It
understanding.
gives you the map, but you got to choose how you want to travel.
Exactly. And sometimes the most scenic routes, the most rewarding ones, they're the ones that require little exploration, a little willingness to step outside of that comfort zone.
I love that. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about the EA conservation,
Yeah.
not just as like a type, but as a complex, dynamic individual. Any final thoughts for our listener before we wrap up?
I would just encourage them to keep exploring the Enneagram, whether you're an 8 yourself or you're just trying to understand the people in your life, your loved ones, your colleagues. The system, it offers such valuable insights into human behavior, why we do the things we do.
Yeah, like it's like cracking the code.
It is. It is. And that knowledge, it can be incredibly empowering. It allows us to navigate our relationships with more empathy, more compassion, and even a little bit of humor.
I couldn't agree more. So to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights into the world of the EA conservation. Remember, it's not about, labels or boxes. It's
Yeah.
about understanding growth and finding those healthy ways to express our true selves.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. There's a whole world of self-discovery waiting for you.
Until next time.